Sabra Lane. Well, for more, we're joined now by our political editor, Lyndal Curtis in Canberra. Lyndal, there's already been some action in the House on the budget this morning.
Yes, the government's already introduced the legislation to change what was called the education tax rebate, where people had to provide receipts on their spending on their children's education in order to get some money back, into what's now called the school kids bonus, where the government will pay out the money regardless of whether you have receipts or not. The government wants to begin paying out that money before the end of the financial year, so the legislation for it has to be passed pretty quickly. The government's already begun that task, but it does look as though the coalition is going to oppose it. I've been joined by the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Cormann. Matthias, welcome to ABC News 24.
Good to be here.
You will definitely be opposing the school kids bonus?
We will definitely be opposing it. I mean, the government is borrowing money they haven't got to give it away. And of course, shifting expenditure from 2012 to this financial year is not achieving a spending cut next year. It is cooking the books to make it look like there is going to be a surplus in 2012-13 rather than to deliver a genuine surplus.
But it seems to be that you're going to back the increase in the family tax benefit Part A. In the end, what's the real difference between that and the school kids bonus?
Well, we've made a judgment on what is appropriate and what isn't, and to sort of just hand out cash, go for another cash splash without any strings attached whatsoever, borrowing money that the government hasn't got, and to get it out of
family tax benefit Part A, handing out money with no strings attached,
and to hand it out, trying to rush it out of the door as quickly as possible is just completely inappropriate. We've made a judgment in relation to family tax benefit Part A that in the context of Labor's toxic carbon tax, which will push up the cost of living, which of course will make Australia less competitive internationally, that it is appropriate for us to support that particular measure, but we just can't support the government's cash splash in relation to the schools kids bonus as you've described it.
If you see the family tax benefit changes as part of the carbon tax compensation, why won't you commit to wind that back as you are winding back all the formal carbon tax compensation?
Well, what we've said is that we'll consider it, and of course right now, I mean, our commitment is to rescind the carbon tax. Our commitment is to get rid of this terrible tax, which will increase the cost of living, which will of course cost jobs, and which will do nothing to reduce emissions in Australia. So we think the carbon tax is a bad tax for household budgets, it's a bad tax for our budget. And of course you're quite right, that once we rescind the carbon tax, there's a whole range of expenditure items that will be able to be taken off the books. We will be releasing all of the detail on how that is going to look in detail in good time before the next election.
But again, if you say the family tax benefit changes are effectively part of the carbon tax compensation, is that then not necessary once the tax is gone and the cost of living falls?
Well, we have said in the current environment that we are inclined to support the changes to the family tax benefit arrangements. Of course, our commitment to abolish the carbon tax is the real help to Australian families. Australian families don't want this carbon tax. They were promised that they wouldn't have a carbon tax. And of course, if this government was serious about taking pressure off families, they would be committing to rescinding the carbon tax, which we were promised we wouldn't get.
But there is still a chance that you will support the family tax benefit changes and you won't unwind them. You will keep them going.
Well, I mean, let's just go through this budget cycle, these budget debates. We've said that we're going to go through a proper process and consider the budget in its totality. There's obviously still a whole range of questions that we will want to ask about the detail. What we are very clear about is that we will not be supporting this school kids bonus. We just think it is a reckless cash splash from a government that is desperate to make it, that is desperate to just provide people with a sugar hit in the context of a carbon tax which they know is hurting the government.
But if, in the end, if the government had stayed with the education tax rebate and people had put in receipts and claimed the money, they would have got the money anyway. They are spending it. Parents spend money on their kids' education all the time, so why not just deliver it in a different way?
Well, quite frankly, the way the government is handling this is completely outrageous. I mean, they're trying to get as much cash out of the door as quickly as possible. That is not a sensible and appropriate way to handle taxpayers' money. Taxpayers' money should be handled with respect. We should have a government that spends less so that we can tax less, so that we can focus on increasing our productivity growth again, strengthening our economy. I mean, this is a government that in this budget has not cut spending, it has increased taxes, it has pursued a lifting of the debt ceiling yet again now to $300 billion, an increase in the debt ceiling of $300 billion, and of course a government which will impose the world's largest carbon tax. But I ask you, why would a government that tells us that they will have surplus budgets all over the forward estimates, why would such a government have to increase the debt ceiling to $300 billion? If the government was really confident that they would be delivering surplus budgets, why do they need to increase the debt ceiling to $300 billion?
Doesn't, though, gross debt, which you talk about all the time, play a role in keeping a liquid and stable bond market? That means people can invest in what are AAA-rated bonds. That it plays a role in raising money for government, sure, but it also plays a role in the bond market. Well,
I mean, a couple of years ago, the government increased the debt ceiling from $75 billion to $200 billion. And we were told at the time that the reason for that was the global financial crisis. Then in last year's budget, they increased the debt ceiling from $200 billion to $250 billion. And now we're told that there's going to be surplus budgets in every single year over the forward estimates. But somehow the government's debt levels will increase to up to $300 billion.
It's only the potential debt. It's not the government saying debt will fall. It just gives it some wriggle room to move if it needs it.
Some wriggle room. Well, and I guess what we know is that over the last 12 months, we were told that the budget deficit this year will be $22.6 billion. It's now $44.4 billion. That is an increase of nearly $22 billion. And of course, that is the sort of wriggle room, no doubt, that the government is looking for. And no doubt, the government clearly doesn't trust its own commitment to a surplus, because why would they otherwise go for an increase in the debt ceiling to $300 billion?
If I could ask you quickly about company tax. Business is unhappy that the company tax cut was scrapped, but did the government have any other option after you said you'd oppose the lot and the Greens said they'd oppose the tax cut for big business?
The government was never serious about a company tax cut. If they had been serious, they would have stuck with it the same way as they stuck with other...
But if they can't get it through the Parliament, then
that hasn't stopped them for including the terrible private health insurance, the means testing of the private health insurance rebate, budget after budget. It was rejected by the Senate and the House of Representatives year after year, and the government kept putting it back in. If the government had really been serious about the company tax cuts, they would have introduced them into the Parliament together as part of the mining tax package of bills with the 11 pieces of legislation that have gone through the Parliament. They never were serious about it. They're just trying to now run for cover and try to blame us. We are committed to lower company taxes. We've already committed to a modest company tax cut in government, and we of course will deliver that without the need for mining tax.
Matthias Cormann, thank you very much for your time.
Good to be here.
And back to you, Joe.
Lyndal, just before you go, I don't know if we've still got that line open, but Lyndal, if I could just ask you, the Prime Minister was saying this morning that she's determined to see some sort of company tax cut for business. What's the likelihood of that actually happening now?
Well, the government's got a business tax working group looking at tax reform specifically targeted to business, and the government's saying if business through that process can find ways of offsetting the spend that would be required to have a company tax cut, it's happy to have another go at it. But it does seem from talking to government members that the government actually wants the business to do some of the heavy lifting, not only in finding the savings, but also in prosecuting the case and putting the pressure on the other parties in the Parliament, the Coalition and the Greens, to get a company tax cut through the Parliament.
OK, Lyndal Curtis in Canberra, no doubt. We'll be talking to you again through the day.
Thank you.